David is a psychiatrist and a professor of neuropsychopharmacology at Imperial College. His research area is psychopharmacology, which is the study of the effects of drugs on the brain. And David looks particularly from the perspective of how drug treatments in psychiatry and neurology work in the brain, and also why people get addicted to some drugs like alcohol. But I think the main thing and the reason why this room is full and why we're all here today is we're sort of on the cusp of a revolution in psychiatric medicine. After almost 50 years of prohibition, of criminalisation, we are in a place now where some of these drugs will become medicines. So we've shown through science, you have shown through science, that these drugs are not dangerous and harmful, and actually when used properly can be extremely beneficial. So I guess my first question to you is, what have you learned from all your years, your experience with drug policy, with government, and what's the current status quo with these drugs?
Well, I've learned that there is zero relationship between science and drug policy. That was what I was saying when I got sacked. So, but as you pointed out, in a way that was quite a seminal moment, not just for me, but also for the field, because for the first time people began to ask questions about the sense and the balance and the rationale for policies, because it is quite unusual to sack your chief advisor because you don't like what they say. I mean, normally you reprimand them, and they tried that a few times, but to sack them, it does make people think and listen, and it certainly got a debate going. Until I was sacked, really, there wasn't a lot of what you might call certainly there weren't many scientists prepared to stand up and say what they really believe, which is that the drug structure, the classification and scheduling in this country and internationally was actually not evidence-based. Now, some people in hindsight, as one of my friends wrote to me afterwards, after his sacking, he said, David, your problem, Nutt, is that you don't really understand literature. I said, what? He said, yes, I think it was Voltaire who said, it is dangerous to be right when the government is wrong. But at least they didn't put me to the guillotine. And the discussion started. And it's gone on, and it's actually really, the fact that so many of you are here tonight, I mean, I don't need to ask if any of you actually believe that the current drug laws make sense, because there would be none of you who did, and maybe if there was one or two, you'd probably be marched out straight away. So things have changed because there is a public discourse, and the fact that I can write a book about psychedelics is something I probably couldn't have done 10 years ago, frankly.
Yeah, well, you certainly might not have had many open readers. But, the backdrop right now is that we have MAPS putting through MDMA, which could be approved as a treatment in the US as early as 2025. And we have many of these drugs in phase 2. So I suppose the status quo in what we have, which is a Schedule 1 classification for these drugs, which means that they have no therapeutic potential, is very much at odds with the science that we're going to be discussing today. So I guess my biggest question is, why are psychedelics back in the mainstream? What was the scientific revelation that has led to the breakthrough status from the FDA and the movement we've seen in the clinical literature?
Well, there have been a number of separate strands to the sort of resurrection of psychedelics. I mean, the first, as you mentioned, is MAPS, this American organization that's run by Rick Doblin, who were using MDMA, which is colloquially known, of course, as ecstasy. They were using it in therapy before it became widely used in raves, and they were finding it very effective. And they were very angry when it got to ban, simply because young people were using it recreationally. And they campaigned quite vigorously, and actually they succeeded in getting the ban revoked, at least on one occasion in the States. But eventually, as always happens, the bureaucrats overtook the science and the medics, and MDMA was banned in America. And just for those of you who don't know, that until very recently, what the US said about drugs and drug policy was endorsed certainly by us and by almost every other country in the world, because they had such a huge influence in the UN. So the MAPS, the MDMA story, is one of really persevering with the knowledge that these drugs could be that drug particularly could be therapeutic and in psychotherapy as an augmentation for psychotherapy. And what they did was very clever. They realized that you couldn't persuade a rescheduling based on the fact that MDMA could help couples get together again. It was where it was being used in couples counseling. They targeted a really serious, a very difficult problem, which is PTSD. And of course, over the last 30 years, as MAPS has been developing its research, the American burden of PTSD has been rising and rising and rising on account of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, etc. So they saw the need for a new treatment. And I think they've got it. Their current data is very compelling, and it would be surprising if it didn't get licensed. Now, the psychedelic story is a rather different story, and it's been driven really by, I think, by two separate strands of evidence. One is our own work, which began to explore the brain mechanisms of psychedelics. And that was really an intellectual question. I like to, one of my claims to fame, which isn't in my CV, but maybe it's not correct, but I'll share with you, is that I've probably given more different kinds of drugs to human beings than anyone else ever. Possible exception of the KGB, I suppose. I'm not entirely sure about that. But I've done it in good faith and with their consent. The last major psychoactive drug to be studied was psychedelics, and so we started doing the brain science of psychedelics. And I'll be absolutely honest with you, I never started out thinking we would be using psilocybin, magic mushroom juice, to treat depression. We started off asking a simple question: what is a psychedelic trip? And we discovered what it was, and we published a lot about it, and we've now got huge insights into how these drugs work. But it was the brain science that made us think that these drugs could be useful for depression for a number of reasons, but the most obvious one was it produced changes in the brain that other treatments for depression do. It just did it faster. On the other side of the pond, in the States, the Johns Hopkins group, Roland Griffiths, was about pioneering psychedelic research with a slightly different, from a different perspective, a different aim. And he was heavily into meditation and began to ask the questions as to whether you could replicate the health benefits of meditation using psychedelics. So they pursued the psychological approach, we pursued the neurological, neuroscience approach. And they've worked really extremely well together because now we can make sense of each other's findings. And based on that, and then of course moving into the clinical treatment arena, the results have been spectacular. I mean, almost every study has shown powerful effects in people who failed on other treatments with very, very low level of side effects, as you mentioned.
I think just to point out, one of those trials was the recent phase 3 from MAPS, where I believe 69% of people after just one treatment were in remission still at 3 months, which is pretty extraordinary. I think this combination of, I suppose, David's research and his team's research at Imperial, Johns Hopkins, the work at MAPS has culminated in this sort of new industry. But I think the reality is we've had a very long history with these compounds, haven't we? I mean, there's some interesting facts here. Ibogaine was marketed in France as a neurostimulant in the 1930s. I mean, that's quite a lot. And psilocybin was marketed under indocybin for depression. So I guess my first question to you is, what drugs are we talking about in particular? And then what is our history with some of these drugs, particularly the classics?
So when we talk psychedelic, is usually is a term which was invented by a psychiatrist called Osmond and kind of validated to some extent by Huxley. Psychedelic means mind manifesting, and when we talk about psychedelics, we're usually talking about drugs like psilocybin, ayahuasca, which is a drinkable form of DMT, dimethyltryptamine, LSD. Those are the sort of big three of the serotonergic psychedelics, the classic psychedelics. But then there are other drugs like ibogaine, which comes from a West African plant. There's salvia, which produces strange kinds of hallucinations which aren't generally very therapeutic. And then there's also ketamine. And, you can contest that if you want. But
I dare you.
But, yeah, I think there's not a lot of clinical research going on with salvia. Anyway, and And then, of course, there's ketamine. And ketamine is a very interesting drug because it's pharmacologically quite distinct from the classic psychedelics. But it does produce profound alterations in consciousness. And it has one great advantage, which is that it's legal because it's an anesthetic and a painkiller. So there's a lot of work going on in groups, by groups who cannot use psychedelics because of the complexity of the regulations, using ketamine as a kind of proxy for them. And that's also, I think, consolidating our confidence that this approach is actually working.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but ketamine is being used currently by Awaken, a company you're involved in right now, for alcohol use disorder. Is that correct?
Yes, I mean, one of the things that's very, very frustrating in working in this field, I'm a psychiatrist, as you heard at the beginning, it is impossible to treat people with psychedelics in this country unless you have a clinical trial. And clinical trials are very, very expensive, costly to set up. It's very hard to get funding. I mean, one of the saddest things was that our first depression study was actually funded by the Medical Research Council in 2012. And it's revolutionized people's thinking about how you treat depression. The findings have initiated, they've sparked many companies, and Sean probably knows better than I have, how many, working in this space. But in the last 10 years, we have never managed to get a single extra penny from the government. They've turned down the last 6 grants we've written. And you don't really know why. And it's quite sad, really, because the UK was leading, and now we're a long way behind. And you'll hear probably in a minute how just earlier last month, Australia made psilocybin a medicine for the kind of people I would like to be using it for, people with treatment-resistant depression. So what can we do in this country? Well, the only thing we can do in this country is give those people ketamine. And one of the companies I work with is called Awaken, and it's set up to do that. It's set up to use ketamine to treat disorders which ketamine might help, and one of them is addiction, and just in the same way as other psychedelics can be used for addiction. But it's so disappointing that we have to use a proxy for a proper psychedelic because the regulations make it impossible to use drugs like psilocybin and DMT.